I turned 88 last winter. These days the house is so quiet that sometimes I swear I can hear the clock breathing. That old clock on the wall has been with me longer than most people in my life. It ticks slowly, patiently, like it knows something I spent my whole life trying not to understand. You'd think a man who lived nearly 9 decades would have stories about war or love or adventure. But the truth is, the story that haunts me most is about something much smaller. A little girl with braids. My daughter, her name is Emily. And the strangest thing about it all is that I was there when she was born. I held her in my arms that first night. I promised her mother I would always be there, yet somehow I missed almost everything that came after. I didn't see her first school play. I don't remember the day she learned to ride a bicycle, and I can't recall the last time she ran into my arms as a child. It's a strange thing realizing you were physically present in a house, but absent from someone's entire childhood. People assume men like me must have sacrificed those moments for something important, a noble reason, a great responsibility. But the truth? What I chose instead of my daughter wasn't noble at all. In fact, it might be the most meaningless thing a man could give his life to, and that's the part I've never had the courage to say out loud until now. I was 36 years old when Emily was born. By then, I already believed I understood how life worked. A man woke up early, worked hard, paid his bills, and kept food on the table. That was the formula my father lived by, and his father before him. Love, in my mind, wasn't about long talks or bedtime stories. Love was providing. At least that's what I told myself. My wife, Margaret, was 28 when Emily arrived. She had this calm warmth about her that made every room feel like home. Even during the long hours of labor, she somehow kept smiling at me like everything was going exactly the way it was meant to. When the nurse finally placed Emily in my arms, I remember feeling something shift inside my chest. She was so small that her entire hand wrapped around just one of my fingers. And I remember whispering something I had never said before. "I'll take care of you." For the first few months, life felt steady. We lived in a small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street. Nothing fancy. The paint on the porch was peeling, and the kitchen floor creaked whenever you stepped near the refrigerator. But Margaret filled that house with laughter. And Emily, well, Emily filled it with life. I still remember the sound of her crying at night. Margaret would gently nudge me and whisper, "Your turn." Half the time I'd pretend not to hear. But sometimes I'd get up, shuffle down the hallway, and pick Emily up from her crib. She'd calm down almost instantly once she felt someone holding her. Those were quiet moments. Just the two of us in the dim hallway light. I didn't know it then, but those were the easiest days of fatherhood. Back then I was working at a small electronics repair shop downtown. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid enough for groceries, the mortgage, and the occasional dinner out. Every evening I came home around 6. Margaret would already be in the kitchen, humming while stirring something on the stove. Emily would be in her high chair banging a spoon against the tray like she was conducting an orchestra. Margaret used to laugh and say, "She gets that from you." I'd shrug and kiss Emily on the head. Life felt simple, predictable, safe. But there was something about me that had always been restless. Even when things were good, I kept thinking there had to be something more. Not more money exactly. More importance. More recognition. My father had been a factory worker his entire life. Hard-working man, but by the time he died most people barely remembered his name. I used to think about that a lot. The idea of living your whole life, only to quietly disappear. That thought bothered me more than I ever admitted. Around the time Emily turned 3, something started changing. At first it seemed harmless. One of the guys at the repair shop had this little radio he kept behind the counter. During slow hours we'd listen to sports broadcasts. Baseball mostly. I had always liked the game, but something about those broadcasts hooked me differently. The announcers made every moment sound important. The tension. The statistics. The strategies. It felt like a world where everything mattered. Soon I started staying late at the shop just to hear the games. Margaret didn't complain at first. She'd greet me at the door with Emily on her hip and say, "Long day." I'd nod and say, "Busy." And technically, that wasn't a lie. But slowly, something subtle began happening. The dinners got colder. Emily started falling asleep before I got home. Margaret would leave a plate for me on the stove with a little note beside it. Heat for 2 minutes. I remember one evening when Emily was about 4 years old. I walked in late again and Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table alone. No music. No humming. Just silence. She looked tired. Not angry. Just tired. "Emily waited for you tonight," she said softly. I asked why. "She wanted to show you something she drew." I glanced toward the refrigerator and saw a crooked crayon drawing taped to the door. Stick figures holding hands under a big yellow sun. 3 of them. One was clearly meant to be me. Margaret said she fell asleep waiting. I remember staring at that drawing for a moment. And then I said something I wish I could take back. "I'll see it in the morning." Morning never came the way I imagined. Because that night turned into another late evening at the shop. And the next night after that. And the next. When Emily started kindergarten, Margaret asked if I could come to her first school assembly. "She's nervous," Margaret said. "It would mean a lot if you were there." I promised I would. I even marked it on the calendar. But the night before the assembly, there was a big championship game on the radio. Everyone at the shop was talking about it. The entire city seemed excited. So I stayed up late listening. By morning I overslept. Margaret didn't yell when I woke up. She didn't argue. She just quietly said, "It already happened." Emily never mentioned it. Not once. Kids are strange that way. They forgive things before they even understand them. Over the years, the house stayed warm and full of life. Margaret kept cooking. Emily kept drawing pictures and taping them to the refrigerator. But I slowly became a man who was present in photographs, yet missing from the memories inside them. There were school plays I missed. Birthday candles I never saw her blow out. Conversations between mother and daughter that I only overheard through half-closed doors. At the time, I convinced myself it was temporary. Just a phase. Just something I enjoyed during my free time. But I didn't notice something very important. Every time I chose that little radio, every time I said, "Maybe next time," Emily was growing older. And childhood doesn't wait for anyone. Not even a father who believes he still has plenty of time. Emily was 9 when I first realized something had changed between us. Not all at once. Nothing dramatic. No shouting or slammed doors. Just small things. Little silences that began appearing where laughter used to be. By that time the repair shop had grown busier, and I had convinced myself that meant I was doing something right with my life. Customers trusted me. People came in asking for me by name. Recognition. That word had started to mean more to me than I realized. But the truth was, work wasn't the thing pulling me away from home anymore. It was that radio. Baseball had slowly turned from background noise into something else entirely. I followed every game, every statistic, every player trade like it was a matter of personal importance. I bought newspapers just to read the sports pages. I started recording broadcasts so I could replay moments I'd missed. I even joined a small group of men at the local diner who met twice a week just to argue about teams and strategies. Margaret used to tease me about it. "Are they paying you to manage the team yet?" she'd ask with a smile. I'd laugh it off. Back then it still felt harmless. Just a hobby. But hobbies have a way of quietly expanding until they start pushing other things out of the room. Emily was in 4th grade when her school announced a parent-child science fair. Margaret told me about it one evening while we were clearing the dinner plates. She wants to build a little solar system model, Margaret said. Emily looked at me with those hopeful eyes kids have when they believe their parents can do anything. "Can you help me, Dad?" Of course I said yes. It sounded simple enough. Just cardboard planets and some paint. But the week the project was due happened to be the start of the baseball playoffs. Every night there was another game. Another crucial moment. Another reason to sit close to that radio and not move. Emily worked on the project at the kitchen table with Margaret while the games played in the living room. Sometimes she would walk in holding a planet made of paper mache. "Does this look like Saturn?" I'd glance over for 2 seconds. "Looks great, kiddo." Then my attention would drift right back to the announcer's voice. The night before the fair, Emily knocked on the living room door again. "Dad?" I remember feeling irritated because the game was in the 9th inning. "What is it, Em?" She held up the model carefully. The planets hung from thin pieces of string inside a cardboard box painted black with little white stars. "I finished it," she said quietly. I nodded without really looking. "Good job." She waited there for a moment like she wanted something more. Maybe a closer look. Maybe a few minutes together. But the crowd on the radio suddenly erupted with cheering and my attention snapped right back to the game. After a few seconds, she turned around and walked back to her room. The next evening Margaret came home from the science fair with the model still in the box. It had a small blue ribbon taped to the corner. "Second place." "She kept looking for you," Margaret said softly while setting it on the kitchen counter. I asked what she meant. Every time the door opened, she thought it was you. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said nothing. That became my pattern. Silence was easier than facing the small disappointments stacking up inside our house. Years passed like that. Emily grew taller. Her braids disappeared and were replaced by long brown hair she wore in a ponytail. She stopped asking me for help with homework. Stopped knocking on the living room door. Instead, she spent more time in her room or talking with Margaret in the kitchen. And the strangest part? I barely noticed the distance forming. When something becomes routine, you stop questioning it. My routine was simple. Wake up. Go to work. Come home. Turn on the radio. Follow the games. Argue with the guys at the diner. Repeat. Meanwhile, childhood kept moving forward without me. One summer afternoon when Emily was 13, Margaret asked if I could drive her to softball practice. "I have a dentist appointment," she said. "You're off today anyway." I remember agreeing. But that afternoon there was a special doubleheader game on the radio. A historic matchup everyone had been talking about all week. I told Emily we'd leave after the first inning. Then the second inning became the fifth. The fifth became the seventh. By the time I looked at the clock, practice had already started. Emily stood quietly near the door holding her glove. "It's okay," she said. "I'll just ride my bike." Margaret returned later that evening and found Emily's bike still leaning against the fence. She had walked the whole way. 3 miles. Margaret didn't yell. She never yelled. But that night she sat across from me at the kitchen table with a look I had never seen before. Not anger. Not even disappointment. Something deeper. "Do you know what Emily told me today?" she asked. I shook my head. "She said she stopped asking you for things because you always look busy." That sentence stayed in the air for a long time. I remember feeling defensive. I told Margaret I worked hard for this family. I told her everyone needed time to relax. I told her she was making a big deal out of nothing. She listened quietly. Then she said something that I didn't understand back then. "You're missing her life, John." I shrugged it off. I truly believed there would be plenty of time later. Teenagers become adults eventually. Families reconnect. Life slows down. That's what I thought. But there's a moment in every parent's life when childhood quietly ends. You rarely notice it while it's happening. For me, that moment came one evening when Emily was 16. I walked into the house and saw Margaret sitting alone in the living room. Emily's bedroom door was open. The walls were bare. The drawings that once covered the refrigerator were gone. Margaret looked up at me with tired eyes. "She left for college orientation today," she said. I stood there confused. "Today?" Margaret nodded slowly. "She told you last month." I searched my memory. And then it hit me. She had told me. But the radio had been on. And I had only half listened. Margaret looked at me for a long time before speaking again. "You missed it," she said quietly. But the thing I didn't understand in that moment was that I hadn't just missed a day. I had missed her entire childhood. After Emily left for college, the house became quiet in a way I had never experienced before. Not peaceful quiet. Empty quiet. The kind that makes every little sound feel louder than it should be. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen. The creak of the hallway floor. Even the ticking of that old wall clock suddenly felt different, like it was counting something down. At first, I told myself nothing had really changed. Kids grow up. They leave home. That's just how life works. Margaret still cooked dinner most evenings. We still sat at the same kitchen table. The same plates, the same chairs, the same view out the window toward the maple tree in the yard. But the house had lost something. Emily's laughter used to echo down the hallway. Her music used to drift out from under her bedroom door. Now that door stayed open, and the room inside it barely looked lived in anymore. Margaret kept it clean. She folded Emily's old blankets neatly on the bed and dusted the shelves every week. But it felt more like a museum than a bedroom. A quiet place filled with memories no one was making anymore. Emily called occasionally during her first year away. Most of the time she spoke with Margaret. I'd hear Margaret laughing softly in the kitchen while they talked about classes, roommates, and professors. Sometimes Margaret would hold the phone out and say, "Your dad's here too." I'd take the receiver. "Hey kiddo," I'd say. "Hi, Dad." Our conversations were always short, polite, 2 or 3 minutes at most. We didn't argue, but we didn't really talk either. There's a strange distance that can grow between people who never learned how to connect in the first place. I didn't know how to ask about her life, and she didn't expect me to. Years passed faster than I expected. Emily graduated from college. Margaret and I attended the ceremony together. I remember sitting in the crowd, watching hundreds of young adults cross the stage one by one. When Emily's name was called, Margaret squeezed my hand. "That's our girl," she whispered. Emily looked older than I remembered. Confident. Independent. When she found us in the crowd afterward, Margaret hugged her for a long time. I waited my turn and gave her a quick pat on the shoulder. "I'm proud of you," I said. She smiled politely. "Thanks, Dad." Even in that moment, standing at one of the biggest milestones of her life, I felt like a guest. Not a father. Just someone who happened to be there. Emily eventually moved to another city for work. She visited home once or twice a year at first. Holidays mostly. She and Margaret would talk late into the night, catching up on everything they had missed. I usually went to bed early, or sat in the living room listening to the radio. By then, baseball had been part of my life for nearly 40 years. It had followed me through promotions, layoffs, birthdays, and anniversaries. It had been there every evening when I came home. A constant companion. At least that's what I used to believe. Margaret passed away when I was 79. Cancer. Slow and quiet, just like everything else in her life. Emily came home to help during those last few months. For the first time in decades, the three of us spent long evenings sitting together in the living room. Margaret between us. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just sat there holding her hands. One night Margaret looked at me and said something I've never forgotten. "You know, John, Emily used to sit by that door every evening when she was little." I asked what she meant. "She waited for you to come home," Margaret said gently. "She wanted to tell you about her day." I didn't know how to respond. So I looked down at the floor. Margaret squeezed my hand weakly. "She stopped waiting after a while," she said. "Margaret died 2 weeks later. The house has belonged only to me ever since. Emily still calls sometimes. She has children of her own now. 2 boys. My grandsons. They've visited a few times over the years. Good kids. Bright. Curious. But when they run through the house laughing, I sometimes see flashes of another little girl with braids. A girl who once stood in the doorway holding a cardboard planet. Or a softball glove. Or a crayon drawing taped to the refrigerator. And every time that memory comes back, it brings the same realization with it. I didn't miss her childhood because of work. Or poverty. Or some great sacrifice. I missed it because of something meaningless. A radio. A game. Thousands of evenings spent listening to strangers talk about men running across a field. All while my own daughter was growing up just a few rooms away. That's the truth I avoided for most of my life. And the strange thing about regret is that it arrives very late. Long after the moments you needed to change have already passed. Now I sit in this quiet house at 88 years old. The radio is still in the living room. But most nights I leave it turned off. Instead, I sit here listening to that old clock ticking on the wall. Each tick reminding me of something simple I didn't understand when I was younger. Children don't need perfect fathers. They don't even need impressive fathers. They just need fathers who show up, who listen, who put down whatever seems important in that moment and pay attention to the small voice calling from the doorway. Because one day that voice stops calling. And when it does, you realize the game you spent your life listening to was never the one that truly mattered.